Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of Job, and we left off yesterday in verse 5. We enter into a new topic in verse 6 onwards, and I would like to inform you that perhaps some of the things that I may say today might be new to you. But rest assured that what I'm trying to do is to bring out the Hebrew text from the scripture, and I'm not inventing any information that is not there. And so bear in mind that whatever is being shared today really comes from the text itself and not outside the text. And I will be doing a little bit more discussion on some very important topics on the sons of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, as well as the concept of God and the angels, and what they are doing in a different part of the realm that we can't see. And this, from verse 6 onwards, is a dialogue or a set of conversations that is being narrated from a different realm altogether. And one of the personalities that we will talk about is someone called Hasatan. And we will deal with that from the Hebrew and not from the English. Just a recap from yesterday that is important, that we need to understand that God had created the world and he had placed what we call natural laws, right? Natural laws in place. And that's where we get the cause and effect. There's lots of causes and effects that we can see that we can't explain, but they are nevertheless God's way of governing this entire creation. There is also a second aspect that I introduced called divine intervention. And in divine intervention, God does intervene in everyday life, but it is unambiguous. It is not like an everyday affair, but when God intrudes into the natural realm, we call that divine intervention, and it is very obvious. And so these are the background that we have so that we can attempt to understand the book of Job or Eov in its entirety in the first few chapters and then the last few chapters. We are also now looking at a different realm in verse 6. It says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. We have always been reading the English translation, and so the Hebrew words is somewhat different from our English translation. And so allow me then to actually present a little bit of the Hebrew translation so that we can actually spend some time to look at the text itself. And it says, now there was a day, this would be uh, the day, it actually says the day came about. And there seems to be a specific day. This here in verse 6 says it was a day, which is actually not correct. It is the day. Uh, and the day came about. And as I want to mention to you, there is the challenges in the translation. The day came about at this time. And what day was that? Now, in the text, it is not as obvious, but Jewish Tradition says that this is a day where they come together for judging mankind. And there seems to be a regular time that God and his angels do come together. Now, in the Jewish tradition, they call that day Rosh Hashanah, which is somewhat the Jewish New Year. And in their tradition, at least, the day in this case is that day. So this is not just any day, but the Hebrew text tells us that it is a specific day. And the Jews think that it's Rosh Hashanah. Now, this one, sons of God, I think we need to look at the Hebrew. The Hebrew is B'nai Ha Elohim. Now, B'nai Ha Elohim in this case equals angels. In this case, right? In this case. So, one of the things that we have tried to look at the Hebrew is that contextually is very important. And so, sons of God is B'nai Ha Elohim, and it does refer to angels or angels of God. And so we will understand this text as angels and not just humans, right? These are not humans. So we're now talking about a different realm, not on earth, but here in the presence of God. And then it says, came to present themselves before the Lord. Now, this is another translation problem. This entire phrase here, present themselves before the Lord, actually doesn't exist. Okay. So let me strike this out and give you a better translation. It says here, the sons of God or the angels of God came to stand beside or stand against the Lord. So against the Lord. So what does that mean? This is an expression of judgment. And we do see this in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 13. It is always about standing in terms of judgment. And in the ancient days, they don't sit at the court. So this is at the courts of God, right? The court of God. And the angels of God, B'nai Ha Elohim, right here, came to stand beside or stand against the Lord. And then this word here, it says here, and Satan also came among them. And it actually means an even. Satan came in their midst. So not that difficult. So this one also is even. Our challenge today would be this particular word here. And this word in the Hebrew is pas Satan. This is how it is expressed. And this is the adversary. Or how would you say the accuser? What other words can be used for this? Somebody who opposes, the opposer, right? Opposer. I think that would be a good word to use as an opponent, right? And so now let me just explain the difference between this expression and this expression here. One of the things you find that in Hebrew there is no capital letters, and so this word here, hasatan, has being the definite article, and satan is actually is derived from a verb, which is to be an adversary, to accuse, to oppose. And so when it says the Satan, it actually means a particular angel that takes on this specific role as an adversary to God or an opposer to how God wants things to be. So you need to bear with me that some of these might be new to some of you. The concept here is not a particular fallen angel. The concept here is that Hasatan, and so ignore this particular word here because it is not a particular name, but it is a particular role. It is a particular role. And this is about an angel having this specific role. And we'll talk about more of this as we uh, go through the next few verses so that we understand what is this role of Hasatan. So all the angels of God, B'nai Elohim, they were there to stand against God. And Hasatan, the particular one angel who has this role, was also in their midst. And so you would find the imagery that we have God, and then we have all the angels, right? I'll just draw it this way. I don't know how angels look like, but so we have angels all there to stand against God. And that means that they are there to present cases about humans to God. And that's the picture that's being painted here. And one of them is Has Satan. So we just call him Has Satan for now. And he too has something to accuse. But his role is specifically this role to go against whatever God thinks is good. He will go and test the people. Now, there is a purpose for that, and we'll talk more about it as we carry on in the next few verses. Understand that Hasatan is not an enemy of God, but he is seen as an angel that has a specific role that God has given him to play. And so in verse 7, Jehovah said to Hasatan, right? This is Has-Satan. From where do you come from? And Has-Satan, you notice all of these is, well, I would say a mistranslation. Answered the Lord and said, from roaming about on the earth. Now, the idea of roaming about on the earth is going to and fro, right? Going all over. And more importantly, he says he's walking around on it. Well, the word is not walking around. It is walking in it, right? By the way, the word earth, it says here, is literally the land, right? Not earth as the globe, but it could mean the globe. But basically, we are told that Hasatan actually physically appears on the land, and he is going back and forth looking at the people, and he is walking in the land. And one of the traditions that come out from the Jewish commentators really tells us that he couldn't find anyone who is like Abraham. Now, that is from the commentator. So we don't see it here. So I'm just giving it to you as in passing. But it is true that he is going back and forth. He is looking at tempting people, testing people, examining people, and he's coming to tell God certain things, to accuse and to say, no, God, no, the things that you say, it's like that, but it doesn't seem to be. And that's the role that he is playing as Hasatan. And all of these angels of God is also to present cases about the people that they know. And so we find that he is in the realm in God's presence, and he can also be in the realm of human presence. So you would find that angels of God do appear walking around on the land as well. So we read in Genesis chapter 18, Abraham saw three angels who came to the scene. So there are situations where angels do appear, and this is what Satan actually talked about. Has-Satan, or the Satan, or the adversary, or the opposer. Now in verse 8, we are now told, and God said to Has-Satan, says, have you considered my servant Job? Now this word consider is a bit challenging in the English. Have you paid attention? Would be the word, not consider. Have you put it to heart? Right? Put to heart. That would be a more literal meaning. For there is no one like him in the land, right? The land. Blameless and upright. Now, we've seen this in verse 1. Now, blameless in this sense, you find that he is calm, he is complete, he doesn't do anything aside what God tells him to do. He is upright, meaning he is straight. He walks the straight road of God. So you find that this is an A and a B. Blameless and upright is talking about the same thing. His character is so outstanding that even Ezekiel speaks about him. We talked about it yesterday. He also fears God and turns away from evil. We saw this in 1 verse 1. This was a character, and it is repeated. It's repeated many times. It is to tell us that this is the character that God desires. And Job demonstrated that character. And so in the eyes of God, so when Hasatan says, well, I've gone back and forth, I've not found anyone special. And God says, well, have you paid attention to my servant Job? And it is interesting to see this because the phrase here is very unusual. God calls Job my servant, means that Job is a very special person to God. And I said yesterday that Job is not in the period where Israel and the Torah and the law has been given. And so how is Job then a servant? It seems that Job actually knows God very well. And from whatever he has learned in the past, for example, when Adam and Eve came out of the Garden of Eden, we find Cain and Abel knowing what to offer. So there are lots of things that is not written down in the Torah that has been communicated by tradition. And they seem to know how to give offering to God, how not to offend God, but not in the complexity of the Torah, obviously. And in God's eyes, and this is God saying about Job, there is no one like him. Now, the idea like him, or I guess you can say there's no one compared to him in the land. He is blameless, upright. He is God fearing and turning away from evil. So he knows what God doesn't like and he doesn't do it. And God fearing, as I mentioned yesterday, to fear God is to make very careful decisions according to what God likes and what God dislikes. And then by making those decisions correctly, he turns away from all evil, and evil being things which God is not pleased with. So it's always from the eyes of God. And so now we can see Satan is an emissary of God. Satan has to listen to God. Satan has a conversation with God. And so you find Satan or Has-Satan or the Satan or the adversary as someone that God can engage with. And God can put people that he sees that he is, and they are special in their character, to be tested and to be proven to be real by Hasatan, the angel that takes on this particular role as an opposer to how God wants things done. We continue to see the next few verses before we have a short discussion on this Hasatan. And then again, this is Has-Satan. He replied to Jehovah. He says, Does God, does Job fear God for nothing? This is a good translation. You see, fear God is what God has said. He is God fearing. God fearing. Why would Job fear God? And so, as Has-Satan, the accuser, the opposer, he now opposes God's claim to Job. He says, yes, of course, Job will fear you, but does he fear you out of nothing? Now, this word nothing uh, is hinam, and I think this word here has a important meaning that we should be aware of. Um, it would be without cause. You can also say freely. You can actually look at this idea is devoid of cost. And so let me explain this. What was Hasatan arguing? Hasatan is arguing to God that humans doesn't fear him, and especially Job will not fear God without any reason. Job will not fear God freely. He will not fear God by free will. I think we can use this. There is a cost to Job wanting to fear God, and that would be the accuser. The words that Hasatan is trying to argue against God. This in itself is a very interesting conversation that's taking place in the upper realm. Then the accuser continues to argue. He says, have you not made a fence around him? The word fence is hedge, right? A hedge around him. Now, this is an important concept. This word is a hedge. So if you look at the Garden of Eden, Garden of Eden is actually a garden which has hedges around it. So the garden is protected, and the hedge, and that's what a garden is, basically a hedge. And so this is safe. And so the man and the woman, when God first created them, was placed in the Garden of Eden, where there is a hedge around them, and they are safe. Safe from what? Safe from the wildlife that's out there, safe from the environment that is not as I would say as friendly. And so when they were ejected out of the garden, if you recall in Genesis chapter 3, at the end of it, life will be difficult outside the protection of God. That's what it means. So the argument that the Hasatan says, well, God, you have built a hedge around Job, and then his house and all that he has on every side. So basically, we are seeing this here on all four sides. It is well protected by God. So, in concept, Hasatan is arguing against God that Job will definitely fear you because he is in a very luxurious environment. And then he says that you have indeed blessed, you have blessed the work of his hands. The work means everything he has done. The word bless is the same in verse I guess you could say in verse 4, verse 5, right? Verse 5. We were talking about verse 5 yesterday, that Job was afraid that his children might bless God. And we had said that in verse 5, that same word in its context is a negative meaning. That means it is to curse God, to say things that is against God. In this case, we have the same word, barak, and it means the positive side. This is the positive side. This is how we would look at the Hebrew. And God has blessed the work of the hands of Job. And it says that his possessions, his livestock have increased in the land. Now, this is another problem, right? Here it says the land, but it is the same word as it was translated earth before. And so I had personally preferred this to be used, land, right? And so the argument is, God, you have protected him and you have blessed him inside. And of course, he will fear you. Verse 11, this is the opposer, Hasatan, is saying this. He says, but reach out your hand now. The word reach out is to stretch out. Now, in the Hebrew, it is always very vivid that the hand is stretched out. And by the hand stretching out, it actually directs an imagery of power. So when you stretch out your hand and then you touch all that he has, he will certainly, and it says here, he will certainly curse you to your face. Now, this word curse is not barak. In verse 11, no, sorry, this word curse is barak, sorry. But it is now in the negative. And so here you go and touch. Now the idea of touch is to strike. It is to, well, I guess you could say, to lay hand. If you read the Bible, you always say, when somebody lays hand, you're supposed to do something with the object that you lay hand on. Gives you the meaning of destroy. And so the argument that Hasatan says, you go and reach out your hand and touch all he has. So you find here is that there is an A and a B. Stretching out the hand is equivalent to touching. It is about destroying all that he has. And if that be the case, right? If that be the case, then he will definitely curse your face, right? Curse you to your face. And this is the right translation. What does this mean? It means that the opposite of God fearing, the opposite of God fearing is to curse God. To say to say bad things about God. And so if you are God fearing, you would do the right things that God wants. So that would be the picture that Hasatan is painting. So I've tried to show you that Hasatan is having this conversation with God in an engagement to prove to God that his faith or his view of Job is not as correct as he might want it to be. Now, is that the case? The answer is no, we don't know. Right now, all we have is a conversation, and the conversation is for Hasatan to say to God that there is always the element that if you remove all the safety, that he would not be what you think he is. And that would be the test of Job's character. So Hasatan's idea here is always to put to test and to prove God wrong. So tests and temptations and an evil inclination is what Hasatan really puts forth so that there is an element that Job or whoever is tempted might not obey God, might not be loyal to God. And it's a choice. Verse 12. Now it says, then, and this would be, and then after that conversation, and then God said to Hasatan, he says, behold, all that he has is in your, well, this word translated as power literally means hand. It's in your hand. It says, only do not stretch out your hand on him. So do not stretch out your hand on him. So remember uh in verse 11, this idea here, verse 11, Hasatan is saying, God, stretch out your hand. And in verse 12, we find that God is saying, Hasatan, you stretch out your hand. Except not on Job. And so what you find here in verse 12 is quite interesting because Hasatan now represents God, right? He represents God in stretching out his hand. And so we find this representative of God in the idea of angels, right? Angel is malak. And in malak, it is one who walks for another. And so God sends Hasatan to approve this temptation. But there is a limit to what Hasatan can do when he represents God to stretch out his hand, but he is not to do it on Job. So this would be the underlying border. This is the boundary. And so Hasatan departed from the presence of the Lord. Now, the idea of presence of the Lord is the face of God. So now he has a task to do. And what is this task? It is to provide a proof that Job is certainly blameless and upright, God fearing and turning away from all evil. So what we have seen so far is really God and Hasatan having an engagement and God giving Hasatan a job to do, to prove God right or to prove God wrong from a Hasatan standpoint. Now, let me come to a closing remark with regards to Hasatan. Hasatan literally means the adversary. It is not a name, by the way. It's not a name. Although the translation would give it a name, we have in, say, First Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1, we have just Satan, right? Just Satan. And this would be a or an adversary. So we have words like the adversary. We have words like and. This is indefinite article. And so the Bible uses the same word Satan in various forms as verbs as well as nouns, as a definite noun, as Hasatan here in the book of Job, as just Satan in different parts of the Bible, like in First Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1. This describes an opposer instigated David to do a census. And in in Second Samuel, you find that it was God who did that, and in First Chronicles 21, it was a Satan who did that. So we find that God is ascribed all the actions, but the actual work that goes out to test people comes from the angels of God, B'nai Ha-Elohim, that we have seen in verse 6. And amongst them would be these angels of God who accuses, but there is one primary angel that does that. And it's called Hasatan. And that's recorded in this book primarily, I would say primarily. And so we would find that Satan is a role that angels do play to do a few things: to test, to tempt, to put an evil inclination in place. And all of this for one particular purpose. This is about free will. That man is supposed to use the free will to be loyal to God, to fear God, And Hasatan comes and tests that. And the more loyal one is, the greater the test will be. And so that would be the concept of the Hasatan role in testing free will. Now, one thing that we have to say before we close is this: human beings that God had created is given the free will to choose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or not to do that, because each has a consequence. And choices that we all make have consequences. And in many cases, there will be temptations to cause us to make choices that we shouldn't be deciding on. And in those cases, God will reward or judge based on how one would have made those choices. And so Hasatan is seen as one who is there to prove God wrong, to tempt someone like Job that his character is just that great, mainly because he's got everything that God has given him and has protected him. And so we find that when bad things happen, we need not be too concerned, because at the end of the day, as long as we remain faithful and loyal to God, as Job is doing, regardless of what kind of suffering is being put upon us, that God at the end of the day is not judging the temptation, but is always judging the choices made. Basically, telling us that he is judging the free will of man. Remember in Genesis chapter 3, after the what we call that man had eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God asked the man, you know, did you eat? God never said why you ate, but God only wants to prove the free will. Did you freely eat? And he did. He blamed the woman, but God wasn't interested in any excuses. When it came to the woman blamed the snake. But God still asked, did you eat? And she said yes. God tests the free will and judges on the free will. And hence, we will see that in the course of life, choices we make are so important that we need to continue to be God fearing and shun all evil, be blameless, and be upright, regardless of what happens to us. Because it's virtually impossible to explain sometimes. But what is important is the fact that God is the ultimate judge of our lives. And so, no matter the fact that we may not be able to explain natural causes, that we can't really see God's divine intervention, it is no matter, because in the eyes of God, He will judge our free will, the testing, the temptation, the evil inclination to lead us to want to do something against God, to choose to not be loyal to God, will always be there. And the more loyal you are, the more tests that may be. And so, all in all, I just want us to come to a conclusion, at least from the text today, that Hasatan is the adversary. Then Satan, the word by itself would be an adversary. It has an indefinite article, a Satan. It means that angels of God do play those roles, and you've seen that in parts of the prophet books as well. And so it is important for us to realize today very clearly that temptation and tests to see whether we are loyal or not is not a matter of judgment. It is the final decisions that our free will choices are made that will be judged by God. And so God doesn't judge Hasatan. God doesn't judge the angels. Why? Because these angels and Hasatan does not have free will in this sense. They can only do what God tells them to do within the boundaries that God has set for them. And so they are not subjected to judgment and blessings. But the people that God had created and placed in this world, mankind, like you and I, are subjected to such tests of loyalty to God, such that we need to remain to be God fearing and shun all evil things that God doesn't want us to do, regardless of what is happening. And that would be subject to God's judgment. And with this, I hope that it has given you a slightly different perspective of the book of Job. And then when we carry on tomorrow, we will be able to understand what exactly is happening. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.